to turn to 2 Samuel, be in the 23rd chapter, 2 Samuel 23. As we come to this chapter, David is at the end of his life. We read in verse 1 that these be the last words of David. And in this chapter, David is reviewing his life. Verses 1 and 2, he sees his life as a wonderful privilege. He mentions his small beginnings. In verse 1, he says, David, the son of Jesse. But then he mentions that God raised him up, raised up on high. Started very, very small. God raised him up. He mentions that he was the anointed of God. What he's doing is any success that he had, he attributed to the Lord. In verse 2, he speaks of the fact that he was inspired of the Holy Spirit. God spoke to and through him. Verses 3 and 4, he views his life as a wonderful opportunity. He says, the God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spake to me. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning when the sun riseth, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. He uses, in those verses, he just is saying, God's given me wonderful opportunities. In verse 5, he concludes by saying that though his promises were broken, his promises to God were broken, God's promises remain true. So as David views his life, he basically is saying, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. In verses 8 through 39, David speaks of some men that God put in his life. He makes mention of all total 37 men. And we see that in verse 39, the last words of verse 39, 30 and 7 in all. These men that he mentions were men who were distinguished by mighty exploits of service to God and of service to Israel. He divides these men into three categories. The first three, Adino, Eleazar, and Shammah. He mentions them in verses 8 through 17, and then he mentions the exploit that each one did. Two others, which would be the second rank, he mentions Abishai and Benaiah in verses 18 through 23. He then would go on and mention 32 more in verses 24 through 39. Well, we want to look today at 2 Samuel 23, verses 13 through 17, concerning these first three and what they did on one occasion that he recalls to memory. So 2 Samuel 23, begin reading with verse 13. And 3 of the 30. You say, well, there were 37. Well, at the time this event took place, there were 30. So 3 of the 30 chief went down and came to David in the harvest time, unto the cave of Adullam. And the troop of the Philistines pitched in the valley of Rephaim. And David was then in hold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. And David longed, and said, Oh, that one would give me drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate. And the three mighty men brake through the host of the Philistines, and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it, and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink thereof, but poured it out unto the Lord. And he said, Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives? Therefore he would not drink it. These things did these three mighty men. So in these verses, David recalls an incident that took place in a cave. It goes back to 1 Samuel chapter 22, when the uncrowned David was a fugitive. And he took refuge in the cave of Adullam from the murderous designs of Saul. It was from this cave that David wrote the 57th and the 142nd Psalm. So we want to look at this incident and gather some spiritual lessons that will benefit us. Our subject is lessons from the cave of Adullam. There are several individuals we can learn from here. One, though he's not mentioned in our text, we can learn from Saul and what the Philistines had done. In verse 13, David is in the cave of Adullam. And we read, the troop of the Philistines pitched in the valley of Rephaim. The reason that David is in the cave is Saul. Saul's the reason. And we learn some lessons here from Saul. By way of warning, Saul became distracted with David. Saul was king over Israel. He had been invested with power. It was his responsibility to protect the nation of Israel from their enemies. But Saul misidentified the enemy, and he began to see David as the enemy. He became obsessed, absolutely obsessed with killing David. Notice if you go over to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. In verse 8 we read, And Saul was very wroth. He was jealous. The reason, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me have they ascribed but thousands. Verse 9, And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. Verse 12, And Saul was afraid of David. Verse 15, we see the same. He was afraid of him. In verse 29, And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. And Saul became David's enemy continually. Chapter 19, verse 2. Jonathan said to David, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Verse 10, and Saul sought to smite David. We see in verse 15, and Saul sent messengers again to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may slay him. He's absolutely consumed with David. In 1 Samuel 23 and verse 23, Saul said, I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. And in 1 Samuel 24 verse 2, we read that as soon as Saul heard that David was in En-gedi, then Saul took 3,000 chosen men. 3,000 men to get one. Took 3,000 men out of all Israel and went to seek David. Certainly there was a better use of 3,000 men. Without a doubt, there were many other matters that demanded Saul's attention. He's the king. But killing David became the most important thing to Saul. He was obsessed. He was consumed in the wrong matter. And that serves as a warning to you and I. He had many important, as king, many important and crucial matters that demanded his attention. Many people were depending upon him. Many things that were necessary for him to attend to for the good of the kingdom. No doubt there were decisions to make, many issues to face. But the biggest thing going on in Saul's life was David. Saul made David the biggest thing in his life. He made David the biggest issue in his life. We're good at that. And Saul, in his mind, if you would sit down and talk to Saul and say, Saul, why are you doing this? He'd give you good reasons as far as he was concerned. And you look at people that are obsessed with the wrong things and you sit down and talk with them, they'll give you what they think are good reasons to being so obsessed with whatever it is. The whole nation of Israel suffered because of Saul's distraction. The result of the distraction was that while Saul chased David, the Philistines took advantage of the situation. We read in our text that they pitched in the valley of Rephaim. And it was not long before they set up fort on Israelite soil. We see in verse 14, and the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. I don't believe that would have happened had Saul been paying attention to the right things. When an individual, or when a church, or when a husband and wife, or business misplaces their energy and gets their priorities in the wrong order, and they pursue the wrong things, disaster is going to be the result. Spiritually, what happens is the enemy is going to set up some forts. While we're distracted with other things, the enemy sets up its forts, because the enemy doesn't get distracted. You ever notice that? The enemy doesn't get distracted. So the Philistines had a garrison in Bethlehem, David's birthplace, and what would be the birthplace of Christ. We must realize that Satan is a great opportunist. And for that reason, we're told in Ephesians 4:27, neither give place to the devil. And when we're distracted with other things, with other matters, we've given place to the devil. And he's going to take advantage of such. So Saul's distraction with David enabled the Philistines to set up fortifications. Just the same, Satan will make use of our distractions to set up some forts. And what happens when he sets these forts up? Now there's other distractions. And it's just a vicious cycle. So we learn by way of warning from Saul. We also learn from David's mighty men. Now there is a definite correlation between David and these men and Jesus Christ and his people. The first thing we want to notice about these men is they were drawn to David. There's David. He's in the cave of Adullam. He is a fugitive from Saul and from Saul's underlings. He's fleeing for his life, and he takes refuge in a cave. 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 and 2, we see that there came a time where 400 people came to David in that cave. There was also, from reading Psalm 57 and Psalm 142, there was times when David was all alone in the cave. And we see that these people were drawn to David. And that's so of these three men as well, because this incident took place in the cave. They were drawn to David. Their hearts were knit to David. Regardless of David's circumstances, David had nothing to offer these men at this time. He's a fugitive. He has nothing. He has nothing to offer. He's in a place of disgrace. But that did not alter their love for him. They still felt a strong attachment to him. There's really nothing in it for them. But they feel this strong attachment to David. And it shouldn't matter what's in it for us. We ought to feel a strong attachment. We ought to feel a pull toward Jesus Christ. We see David was hated. But these men were not shaped or governed by the attitudes of others. That needs to be us. Jesus Christ is hated. Just mention his name today. You want to see people get mad? Just mention the name. I'm not talking about in vain. Just mention the name. And people get uncomfortable. And people get angry. Almost immediately. More so than I've ever seen it. That name infuriates people. But they were not shaped or governed by the attitudes of others. These men were sensitive to the desires of David. So there's David sitting in the cave. These men are there with him. And we read in verse 15, and David longed. That is, he had earnest desire. And he said. So he expresses his longing. And what follows is what he expressed. And I imagine it was uttered in more of a sigh than a request. An expression of grief that Bethlehem was in the hands of the enemy. But these men, they heard the desire and longing of their king. Oh, that I could have a drink of the well of Bethlehem. They knew, listening to David, they knew that water from Bethlehem would please him. That's all they had to know. Now they're determined to do something about it. That should be all it takes for you and I. To know that such and such will please God. That ought to motivate us. Now they would have to travel about 12 miles from the cave to get to Bethlehem. They would have to go along the dusty and dry hills of Judea. They would have to fight their way through Philistine lines, fight their way to the well, draw the water from the well, probably fight their way back, and then back from the well, and then carry the water 12 miles back to David. And this they did. And they did so willingly. We're told in verse 17 that they did so in jeopardy or risk of their lives. David expressed his desire for a drink of water from Bethlehem. And these men who had subjected themselves to his every desire and who were hanging on his every word to find opportunities to fulfill their service to him, immediately they are in motion. Water from the well of Bethlehem will please David. Off they go. Their mindset is, no matter what danger they had to face, no matter what paths they might have to take, no matter how long it took them, no matter what it might cost them, they were intent on pleasing David. This would please David. All that they had to know was that the water would be pleasing to the king. And they're willing to do whatever necessary to accomplish it. Their desire to please David was bigger than anything else. They knew that David would be pleased with drink of the water out of the well of Bethlehem. It's an amazing thing that God can be pleased by us. That's amazing. That it's mind-boggling. That you and I can please God. That ought to have a tremendous bearing upon us. And oh, how desirous we ought to be to please Him. Just as it was with these men to please David, it ought to be our aspiration to please God. Just as it was with these men to strive to please David, it ought to be our constant pleasing or striving to please the Lord. When David said, "Oh, that one would give me drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem," these men with a feeling of loving attachment to David view this as a great opportunity to be of service to Him. And we ought to view life as an opportunity to please God. We ought to want to please God in everything we do. Everything. When David said, "Oh, that one would give me to drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem," these men with a feeling of loving attachment to David, they now feel obligated to get that water. David didn't issue a command. All David issued was something that would please him. And these men immediately felt obligated. And we ought to feel an obligation to please the Lord. Love and loyalty to David. In love and loyalty to David, they did not think this as an unreasonable obligation. Well, why wouldn't any other water do? Why does it have to be out of the well of Bethlehem? Why can't it be water that's nearby? This was not unreasonable to them. All they needed to know was, this is what David desires. This would be pleasing to David. Therefore, it's not unreasonable. And I'm going to do it. And that's how we need to view life. They were filled with a joyful sense of obligation. They were glad to do it. And we ought to be a people with a joyful sense of obligation to the Lord. When David said, "Oh, that one would give me to drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem," his desire was a drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem. They didn't question that. They didn't question that. Again, it wasn't unreasonable. It filled them with a sense of purpose. David wants water from the well of Bethlehem. Therefore, it is now my purpose in life to get that water. This would please David. And this became their purpose. What pleased David became their aim. And they were driven by this. Many times in counseling, you would think, talking to God's people, that you could say, well, if you do that, that's going to displease the Lord. And you would think, telling that to a child of God, it'd break them down. That's not always the case. I don't care. This is what I'm going to do. I don't care if it pleases God or not. I'm going to please myself for once. Heard it over and over. How sad. Soon as we know something pleases God, that ought to become our purpose. I'm going to please the Lord. So these men heard David speak. Oh, that one would give me to drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem. Again, they put themselves in a place where they could hear David. And what David said was not trivial to them. They were moved by the words of David. They were affected by the desires of David. And here's the way I believe it happened. You can believe whatever you want. And whatever difficulties they had to endure, I hear them saying, this is for David. This is for David. We can keep going. This is for David. Oh, I'm tired. We can keep going. This is for David. This is for David. This is for David. And sometimes that's how we have to endure things. This is for Christ. This is for the Lord. It will please Him. I can endure this. It's for Him. It's for Him. And I believe that was their mindset. And we ought to be a people moved by the words of God. They thought it would be worth it all. Whatever they have to endure, it'll be worth it all because it's for David. And whatever we have to endure, our mindset ought to be, it'll be worth it all because it's pleasing to God. It'll be worth it all. They were consumed. They were engrossed in pleasing David. The thought of pleasing him had gripped their hearts. Absolutely enthralled at the opportunity to be able to do something that would please David. In every place, in every circumstance, and in every undertaking, our attention should be fixed on pleasing the Lord. That's why we're here. To please Him. To please Him. That ought to be our aim. That ought to be our purpose. These men, they had a commitment to David. We read of their actions in verse 16. And what they did, we're told in verse 17, was in jeopardy of their lives. Oh, how highly they thought of David. To put their own lives on the line. Again, David did not command anyone to get this water. He simply expressed a desire. And these three were willing, with their life or death, to serve in whatever way they could. They subjected themselves to his desire. We need to do the same. His desire was all the motivation that they needed. All they needed to know was this would please David. That's all they needed. They had a commitment. They had a commitment to the cause of David. They had a commitment that overcame all odds with faith. They had a commitment which endured difficulty, that endured exhaustion. Oh, I'm so tired. I can't go on. This is for David. This is for David. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, it's so hard. This is for the Lord. Keep going. They had a commitment that was willing to risk life itself. Most people today don't even know what commitment means. They have no idea. These men also had the heart of servants. They didn't feel put out by going 12 miles one way and 12 miles the other to get water for David. They could have gotten water just about anywhere. But they didn't feel put out because it would please David. Don't feel put out. If it pleases God, it's our opportunity. Many, no doubt, would have reasoned with David. David, there's plenty of water nearby. It's just as wet as the water in Bethlehem. Just as cold. Why don't we just go a few hundred yards and get water? But they were not content with minimal service. They wanted to do that which was pleasing to David. God's people through the years, or many who profess to be God's people, they may or may not be, they will make things easy for themselves. It's not about making it, it's not about what's easy. It's about what's pleasing to God. Well, it'd be easier if we did it this way, but that may not be the issue. God's pleased if we do it this way. So we're not going to do it that way. We're not to be content with what's easy. These men hung unto every word out of his mouth. And when he expressed his desire, those words just gripped their hearts. So there are many things we learn from these men. There's also some lessons here from David. David, again, he's in the Cave of Adullam. He's in a place of great trial. He's in obvious distress at times when he was in that cave. Notice in Psalm 57, Psalm 57, Not going to read the entire psalm, but notice verse 4. My soul is among lions. Verse 6. They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They have digged a pit before me, into the midst whereof they are fallen themselves. Selah. He's in great distress. Keep a mark there and go over to Psalm 142. Again, written from the cave. Verses 3 and 4. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me. There were times in that cave when David was overwhelmed. He goes on the latter part of the verse, they have privately laid a snare for me. Again, there were times when he was all alone in the cave. We're reading of a specific time when there were others with him. But in verse 4, he said, I looked on my right hand, and behold, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. So we get the circumstances of David. Now, if we go back to Psalm 57, notice what David did in those circumstances. In verse 2, he said, my soul trusteth in thee. In the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge. I will cry unto God most high, unto the God that performeth all things for me. He shall send from heaven and save me from the reproach of him that would swallow me up. God shall send forth his mercy and his truth. In verse 5, be thou exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let the glory be above all the earth. My heart is fixed, O God, my heart is fixed. I will sing and give praise. Verse 11, be thou exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let thy glory be above all the earth. So there he is in great distress and very difficult circumstances, and his desire is that God would be exalted, and he cries out to God. He trusts God. He's putting his faith in God. And we see the same back over in Psalm 142. In verse 1 he said, I cried unto the Lord with my voice. With my voice in the Lord did I make my supplication. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. Verse 5, I cried unto thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Verse 6, attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name. The righteous shall compass me about, for thou shalt deal bountifully with me. What we see, what we learn from David is how to behave in difficult times, how to behave in adverse circumstances. Cry out to God. Trust God. Believe God. Focus upon God. So we learn from David what to do in a place of trial. But then we also learn from what David did with the water that was brought to him. Again, these men traveled 12 miles approximately from the cave through Philistine lines, drew the water, brought it back to David. They've risked everything to get water for David. They come to the cave. They give the water pail to David. And what did David do? We read in verse 16 that he poured it out. Nevertheless, he would not drink. thereof. Picture these men as they hand the water pail to David. Oh, they can hardly wait to see him take a drink. And he would not drink. He would not drink. And he poured it out. Notice it does not say, and he spilled it. It's not what it says. There's a big difference between spilling and pouring. Spilling is accidental. Pouring's on purpose. He poured it out. That implies forethought. He poured it out. It implies purpose. It implies intention. But he didn't just pour it out. It says they poured it out unto the Lord. Doesn't just say David poured the water out, but he poured it out unto the Lord. And in so doing, he provides an example to us. David, as these men hand him the water pail filled with that water that he so desired, and as he thought upon what it must have took for these men to get this water, he could not selfishly take the water to himself, so he poured it out unto the Lord. In so doing, what he was saying is, the Lord is worthy. The Lord is worthy. No doubt he was thankful for the water. I believe he was overflowed with gratefulness for what these men had done. But as he thought upon what they had done in order to obtain the water for him, and as he thought upon their love and their dedication for him and their hard work and the risk that they took, and when he thought of the weariness and the wounds, I imagine they had some wounds, as he thought upon their endurance, he poured it out unto the Lord. And I believe he did so to serve as an illustration of what these men had done. Again, he poured it out unto the Lord. In that, we're reminded of the Old Testament drink offerings. The drink offerings, of course, were poured out unto the Lord because they were consecrated to Him. It was an offering to Him. It was a service to Him. And we ought to be careful to sanctify what we receive in this manner. Whatever you and I receive in this life, we ought to be willing to consecrate it unto the Lord, to pour it out unto the Lord. Everything that we have, everything we do ought to be unto Him. Poured out unto Him. So when David took that water and poured it out unto the Lord, I believe he poured it all out. I believe he poured every single drop. And I believe he did so with praise to God. He did so with thanksgiving. He did so with love and worship for the honor and the glory of the Lord. He poured it all out, and he never regretted it. And I believe it serves as an illustration that we are to serve God till we have nothing left. Till we have nothing left. And we'll never regret it. We'll never regret it. Again, I've never seen anyone regret on their deathbed serving the Lord. never happened. There's no regret in giving it all. Think about when they handed that water to David. The joy that filled their hearts. And they're thinking, this has been worth it all. Everything we had to go through, it's worth it all. And with great anticipation, they watched David, expecting him to drink that water. And he pours it out unto the Lord. And here's something that's amazing. Not one of them complained. David, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Do you know what we've gone through to get you that water? Not one complained. As he poured it out unto the Lord. When you give unto God, you don't complain about what God does with it. We saw that in the first message. Not one of them complained, but I believe they rejoiced. Because it was for him, and he had the right to do whatever he pleased. We need to believe that. We need to believe that. These men were willing to give all. They were willing to give everything in jeopardy of their lives. And I believe to symbolize that, David poured it out unto the Lord. That's how we're to live. You and I, before salvation, lived lives contrary to God. We lived our lives against God. We lived our lives against His will, against His holiness, against His authority. We lived in direct opposition and rebellion against God. And we fully deserved the wrath of Almighty God. But we've been blessed. We've been blessed abundantly by God. We've been delivered from the curse and from the hand of divine justice. We've been brought out from the fire, washed from the mud and the shame of sin, set free from the dominion of sin, taken off the broad road that leads to destruction. We have been gloriously saved. And now we are to live our lives poured out unto the Lord. And it pleases God. And that's the only reason we need. It pleases Him. Oh, that we would live our lives willing to be poured out unto the Lord until we have nothing left. Till we have nothing left. And our only regret will be that we didn't have more to give. God help us to live lives poured out unto the Lord. Again, if most people would have gone through that trouble to get the water, bring it to David, and then watch David pour it out, they would think he's lost his mind. And that's what they'll think if you and I live our lives poured out unto the Lord. They'll think we've lost our minds. That's okay. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us first song.